The vote was not close. Delegate Ron watched the final count settle on the display above the council floor and felt nothing move inside him. He had expected to feel something, anger, maybe, or the sharp sting of failure. Instead, there was just the number and the silence that followed it, and the quiet sound of 300 delegates exhaling at once like they had all been holding their breath for years and were finally allowed to let it go. Humanity outlawed. Not sanctioned, not suspended. Outlawed, a word the Council reserved for species that had proven themselves too dangerous to negotiate with and too widespread to ignore. It had only been used 4 times in Council history. 2 of those species no longer existed. Ron stayed in his seat while the other delegates filed out. Nobody spoke to him. A few looked in his direction, but none of them held his gaze for more than a second. He did not blame them. He was the human envoy. He was the man who had sat in that chamber for 11 years, shaking hands, filing reports, attending dinners, and telling Earth's government that the relationship was manageable, that the Council was frustrating but not hostile, that patience was the correct strategy. He had been wrong. He had not seen this coming until 3 days before the session, and by then there was nothing left to do except sit in his chair and watch the number finalize. He had 30 standard cycles to return to Earth with the ruling. He took 40. The journey gave him time to write. He drafted 6 different versions of what he would say when he got home. The first was formal, a full reading of the Council's ruling with attached commentary on legal remedies. The second was more personal, an attempt to explain the political currents that had built toward this vote over the last decade. The third was an apology. He deleted that one before he finished it. The fourth and fifth he could not even get past the opening line. The sixth was just 2 sentences, and he read them back to himself twice before deciding they were also wrong. He arrived at Earth's outer relay station and submitted his clearance codes. The operator on the other end processed them without comment, which was normal. What was not normal was the number of ships he could see on the approach, not military vessels, not yet, but cargo haulers and civilian transports moving with a kind of purpose that did not match routine traffic. They were repositioning. He could see it in the way the flight paths clustered near the outer defense platforms. Earth already knew. Someone had leaked the result before his ship had even cleared Council space, and the humans had spent 40 cycles doing what humans apparently did when they received news this bad. They had gotten to work. He landed at the governmental complex in Geneva and was met by Deputy Director Whale, a small man with a very still face who had been running Earth's Foreign Coordination Office for 8 years. Whale did not ask how Ron was doing. He did not offer condolences or express outrage. He handed Ron a cup of tea, sat down across from him and said, "Walk me through the vote count. Which species flipped in the last session?" Ron told him. Whale listened without interrupting, made 3 short notes on his tablet, and then asked about Counselor Yevra specifically, her language during the final session, her body posture, whether she had looked satisfied or simply resolved. Ron thought about it. Resolved, he said. She did not look like someone who had won. She looked like someone who had finally finished a task that had been on her list for a long time. Whale nodded and made another note. They sat in the office for 2 more hours going through every delegate who had voted in favor of the ruling, every abstention, and the 4 who had voted against. At no point did Whale raise his voice. At no point did he use a word like catastrophe or crisis. He treated the outlawing of humanity the way a structural engineer might treat a load-bearing wall that had just been removed, as a problem with a specific shape that required a specific response. When Ron finally played the official recording for the record, Whale listened to it once, set his tablet down, and said, "They gave us 30 cycles to disarm." Ron said yes. Whale said, "That was a mistake on their part. 30 cycles is enough time to do a great many things that are not disarming." He did not explain what he meant. He stood up, thanked Ron for the briefing, and left. Ron stayed in the office alone for a while. Through the window he could see the city going about its afternoon the way it always did. People moving between buildings, vehicles on the transit lines, the ordinary texture of a civilization that had been told it had no legal standing in the galaxy, and had apparently decided to treat that information as a scheduling problem rather than a death sentence. He had spent 11 years in council chambers watching species respond to political pressure with treaties and concessions and careful language. He had never once seen a species respond to being outlawed by simply continuing to function at full capacity. He was not sure yet if that was going to save them or get them all killed. He poured the rest of the tea down the drain, picked up his bag, and went to find out what they were building. The docking request came in at 3:40 station time, which was when Titan Station's overnight crew was at its thinnest, and its shift supervisor was most likely to be on her third cup of whatever passed for coffee in the vending unit near Bay 7. Supervisor Dara Finch read the request twice, then read it a third time to make sure she had not misunderstood something. A Velthari freighter, registration out of the halving system, requesting standard commercial docking clearance for a crew of 9 and an unspecified cargo hold. The ship had come in on a trajectory that avoided every council relay beacon between the inner belt and Titan's outer approach corridor, which meant someone on board knew exactly where those beacons were and had gone to considerable effort to not be seen by them. The council's embargo on human space had been active for 16 cycles. A Velthari ship docking at Titan Station was not just a procedural problem. It was the kind of thing that could give the council a reason to call the embargo a failure and escalate to something with teeth. Dara almost denied the request. She approved it instead and sent an immediate flag to Admiral Orel's duty office. By the time the freighter was secured in Bay 12, Nadia Orel was already on her way down from the command deck, moving at the pace of someone who had not slept well and did not particularly care who noticed. She had 2 junior officers behind her and no patience for preamble. The Velthari who met her at the airlock was shorter than Nadia had expected. The Velthari she had encountered in council-adjacent spaces before had always been in formal attire, all structured fabric and restrained posture, species trained by a century of council oversight to present themselves as non-threatening. This one was wearing a work suit with 3 different kinds of machine oil on the left sleeve, and a tool harness that had been repaired so many times the original color was hard to identify. Her name was Sura. She introduced herself without waiting to be asked, which was also not what Nadia had expected. Sura said her crew had 6 engineers who specialized in shield array configuration. She said they could reconfigure human emitter banks for cross-spectrum resonance output, a modification that would make Earth's existing defensive grid roughly 40% more effective against the weapons load currently carried by Council enforcement vessels. She said she knew what the arrays looked like, because Velthari engineers had built half of them under contract 8 years ago, before the Council had decided that giving humans better shields was an unacceptable security risk and pulled the program. Nadia asked what they wanted in return. Sura said a berth, the right to stay. She said her people had been paying council resource levies for 93 years. She said the levy rate had increased 6 times in that period. She said when her government had filed a formal objection 2 cycles ago, the council had responded by assigning a monitoring delegation to halving and increasing the levy rate a 7th time. She said, "We are not here because we love humans. We are here because we are tired of the alternative." Nadia looked at her for a long moment. Then she told her officers to process the crew through station intake and assign them quarters near Engineering Bay 3. She was back on the command deck when the second alert came in. An unknown vessel on long-range scan, inbound from the direction of the Draani fringe systems. No council transponder, no response to standard hailing. Moving at a speed that suggested they were not concerned about being detected. 20 minutes after that alert, a third contact appeared, smaller, faster, originating from a region of space that the charts listed as uninhabited, but that Nadia's senior intelligence officer said had been home to the pale remnants for at least 4 generations, if you were willing to use old smuggler maps instead of official council surveys. 3 ships, 3 different species, all of them pointed at human space and none of them asking council permission to be there. Nadia pulled up the embargo zone projections and looked at the coverage gaps. The council had designed the embargo to prevent ships from leaving human space. It had not seriously considered the problem of ships trying to get in. Her comms officer told her the Draani vessel was attempting contact on a non-standard frequency. When the channel opened, the voice on the other end spoke in fractured trade common with a Draani accent so thick it took 2 passes through the translation filter to parse. The message, once cleaned up, was simple. We carry medical fabrication units, 6 months of stored biologics, and 2 doctors who specialize in cross-species trauma care. We heard you might need them. Nadia asked how they had heard. There was a pause. Then the Draani said, "We have been watching the council for a long time. We know what it looks like when they decide something needs to disappear. We thought you should know that you are not the first species they have tried this with. We are one of the ones that survived." Nadia closed the channel and sat with that for a moment. She authorized docking for all 3 vessels. Then she sent a message to Ron back on Earth that contained no analysis and no recommendations. Just 2 lines. The first said, "They are coming here." The second said, "I think they have been waiting for an excuse." She did not sleep that night. She pulled up every approach vector in the outer grid and started counting what was coming. And somewhere around 200, she realized the council had made a fundamental error in its understanding of what isolation actually does to the people being isolated. It does not make them alone. Sometimes it just shows them who else is. Admiral Doreth had commanded the 3rd Enforcement Armada for 6 years, without firing a single shot. That was not luck. That was skill, the skill of arriving with enough force that the other party calculated the math and chose differently. He had ended 3 border disputes and 2 resource standoffs using nothing but position, patience, and the willingness to wait longer than whoever was on the other side of the situation. The council valued him for exactly this reason. He was the kind of admiral who made problems go away quietly. He did not feel quiet when his fleet dropped out of transit at the edge of human space, and his censor officer turned around in her chair with an expression Doreth had never seen on her face before. She said, "Sir, you need to see the count." He saw the count. 1,240 vessels. Not a debris field, not a glitch in the sensors. 1,240 ships sitting in organized spread formation around Titan Station, spread across a volume of space that his fleet's approach corridor cut directly through. He had 400 ships. Good ships, well crewed, armed for enforcement. They were outnumbered 3-1 by a collection of vessels that had no business being in the same sector, let alone the same formation. He recognized the silhouettes. Velthari freighters converted with external weapons mounts that still had fresh weld marks on them. Draani carriers, old models that the council had stopped selling replacement parts for 15 years ago, somehow still running. The long needle shapes of pale remnant scout vessels, a design so old it had appeared in council history texts as extinct. And threaded between all of them, human ships, not the sleek military vessels he had expected to face, but civilian haulers and mining platforms and deep-range transports that had been fitted with weapon arrays in what looked like a very large hurry. None of them were moving. None of them were hailing him either. He sent the compliance message as ordered. Full text, official council seal, Embargo Enforcement Protocol 7. The message outlined the terms of humanity's outlawing, demanded the dispersal of all unauthorized vessels from human space within 48 standard hours, and requested that Admiral Nadia Orel respond directly to his command channel to discuss the terms of Earth's compliance. He waited. The response came 11 minutes later, on his command channel, audio only. The voice was calm, not performed calm, not the kind of calm someone uses when they are frightened and trying not to show it. Just calm, the way a person sounds when they have already thought through every version of the conversation and are no longer particularly surprised by any of it. Nadia Orel said, "Admiral, the Council told us we were alone in the galaxy. We spent 16 cycles trying to figure out if that was true. Turns out it was not. I suggest you report that back before you decide on your next move." He asked about the unauthorized vessels. She said she had not invited them. She said they had arrived because they had their own reasons, and if he wanted to understand those reasons, he should read the Council's resource levy records for the last 90 years. She said, "You came here with 400 ships to enforce a ruling against one species. You should have checked how many species that ruling affected." Then the channel closed. Doreth stood at his command display for a long time. His second-in-command, a methodical officer named Breck, came to stand beside him and said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Then Breck said, "Standing orders are to disperse the unauthorized vessels and enforce compliance." Doreth said, "Yes." Breck said, "We are outnumbered 3-1 by a force that has no command structure we can negotiate with, no single authority we can threaten, and no obvious motive to back down." Doreth said also yes. Breck said, "What are your orders?" Doreth looked at the sensor display. He looked at the Velthari ships with their fresh weld marks. He looked at the Draani carriers that should not have been running and were. He looked at the pale remnants, a species the Council had listed as non-factors for 2 decades. And he looked at the human vessels, the mining platforms and haulers, and thought about what it meant that a species under active embargo had managed to quietly assemble this many allies from this many different corners of the galaxy, without the Council's intelligence apparatus noticing, until it was already done. He told Breck, "Hold position. Send no further transmissions to the human station. Mark our current location as a sensor anchor and run continuous count updates." Breck asked, "Shall I report the full count to Council Command?" Doreth said, "Report that we have made contact and are assessing the situation." He did not say, "Do not include the number 1240 in the report," but he did not include it either when he wrote the message himself 20 minutes later and sent it under his own authorization codes. He wrote that enforcement contact had been established and that the situation required further assessment before action was recommended. Later, alone in his command quarters, he asked himself why he had done that, why he had softened the number, why he had chosen assessment over action when the Council's orders were clear. He did not have a satisfying answer. What he had instead was the image of those Draani carriers, ships that had no reason to still be running, ships that the Council had quietly decided to let fall apart by simply stopping the sale of parts, sitting in perfect formation beside a species the Council had just declared an enemy of the galaxy. He thought about what it meant that this was where they had chosen to come. He did not sleep that cycle. Counselor Yevra did not read intelligence reports the way most of her colleagues did. They read for conclusions. She read for what the report writer had chosen not to say. Doreth's assessment from the edge of human space had a great deal of careful language around very few actual numbers. She noticed the absence of numbers. She requested the full sensor logs directly from the third Armadas relay transponder, bypassing the report entirely, and read the raw data herself in her private office with no aides present. 1,240 vessels. She set the number aside and looked at the composition list. Velthari, Draani, pale remnants, a dozen smaller species whose names appeared in Council records mostly in the context of levy assessments and resource allocation disputes. None of them were military powers. None of them had fought a significant engagement in living memory. The Pale Remnants had not even been considered a coherent political entity for 20 years. They were listed in current council databases as a dispersed population with no central governance and no capacity for organized action. And yet there they were, in formation, around a human station. Yevra pulled up the trade records for each species in the gathered fleet, going back 30 years. She was looking for connections, shared interests, diplomatic relationships that might explain how they had coordinated. She found nothing that would qualify as a formal alliance. What she found instead was a pattern she recognized from an entirely different context, the behavior of populations that had been compressed past a certain point. Species that had filed objections and received levy increases in return. Species that had requested council mediation and been assigned monitoring delegations instead. Species that had, in aggregate, been told for decades that their concerns were registered and that the process would proceed in accordance with established procedure. They had not come to human space because of a treaty. They had come because the humans were the first group in recent memory to say no to the council loudly enough that the sound had carried. This did not concern her. What concerned her slightly was Dorath's choice to soften the numbers. She had not confronted him about it. She had noted it and filed the note in a place she would return to later. Dorath was not a disloyal officer. His record over 20 years was exactly what the council needed from an enforcement commander. But something in his assessment language had a quality she associated with officers who were processing new information and had not yet decided what to do with it. She would need to watch that. In the meantime, the strategic picture was manageable. The gathered fleet had no unified command, no shared communication protocol that her intelligence teams had been able to identify, no logistics chain that could sustain a prolonged engagement. The Velthari ships were converted freighters. The Draani carriers were running on parts that should have failed years ago. The Pale Remnants had never been documented using coordinated military tactics in recorded council history. They were a crowd, a large, angry crowd that had gathered around something that had made noise. Crowds dispersed. Crowds made miscalculations. Crowds, and this was the key point she had built her entire recommendation on, had no staying power against a disciplined force with clear orders and unified command. She was composing the order for Dorath to advance when Ron came to see her. She had not invited him. He was technically present in council space as a registered envoy, which gave him the right to request a meeting with any counselor, but it was a right almost never exercised because almost no envoy wanted to be seen using it. Ron did not appear concerned about being seen. He sat across from her and said nothing for a moment, which was a tactic she recognized and did not find impressive. She asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted to make a note for the record. He said, the species that have gathered near human space did not coordinate through political channels. They did not send delegations or sign agreements. They arrived individually over a period of weeks, without communication between them that my teams have been able to find. She said she was aware. He said, that means you cannot negotiate them into leaving. There is no room for offer and counteroffer because there was no negotiation to get them there. They came because something pulled them there. The same thing is pulling them toward the same decision right now, and you will not be able to make them recalculate by applying force to the humans, because the force is not the point. Yevra said, what is the point in your reading? Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the point is that they came to a species the galaxy had just told to disappear and they stood next to them anyway. That is not strategy. That is something older than strategy. And if you advance Dorath's fleet, you will not be fighting an alliance. You will be fighting a feeling. Those do not respond to superior numbers. She listened to this. She considered it. Then she told him the meeting was over. She sent Dorath the advance order 20 minutes later. In his small temporary quarters 2 floors down, Ron opened a personal log file. He wrote one line. She understood every word and none of it landed. Then he started preparing the most accurate after-action record he could write for a conflict that had not yet started, because he was increasingly certain that accuracy was the only useful contribution he had left to make. When the third enforcement armada began its advance, the gathered fleet did something that nobody in Council intelligence had predicted. Nothing. Not a single ship broke formation. Not a single weapon powered up. No hailing signals. No warnings. The 1,200 vessels simply turned, all of them together, like a slow tide changing direction, until every hull was facing the incoming Council armada. It took 4 minutes for all of them to complete the reorientation. Doreth watched it happen on his tactical display, and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite dread and not quite calm, but somewhere between the two, in the place where certainty used to be. His comms officer said, "Admiral, there is an open transmission originating from the human flagship. It is broadcasting on every available frequency, civilian, military, emergency, council relay. It is not encrypted." Doreth said, "Put it on." Nadia Orel's voice came through without introduction. She did not say who she was. She did not address anyone by name. She just started talking, in a measured voice that had none of the performance of a speech and all of the weight of someone reading a document they had spent a long time compiling. She said, "The Velthari have paid a resource levy to the Council for 93 years. The rate has increased 7 times. When they filed a formal objection, the Council responded by increasing the levy an 8th time and assigning a monitoring delegation that the Velthari were required to house and feed at their own expense." She went to the next entry. She said, "The Draani outer carriers filed a request for replacement parts authorization 14 years ago. The Council approved the request, then reversed it 8 months later without explanation. The Draani have been keeping their ships running without sanction parts for 14 years because the Council never formally denied the request. It simply never processed it again." She went to the next. The Pale Remnants, a disputed territory decision that had displaced 60,000 people 30 years ago, a promise of resettlement assistance that had been classified as pending review for 3 decades. The small species whose names Yevra had read in levy records. Each one had a file. Each one had specific dates, specific decisions, specific council reference numbers. Doreth stood at his command display and listened to 11 minutes of this. He did not stop the advance. His orders were to advance, and he continued to follow them, because the alternative was a decision he was not sure he had the authority to make. But he listened, and his crew listened, and the silence on the command deck of the Third Armada's flagship was the kind of silence that fills a room when everyone present has just understood something they would have preferred not to. When Nadia stopped reading, she said, "We are not asking for anything. We are not moving. Whatever comes next is yours to start." Then she went quiet. For 6 minutes, nothing happened. Then a council frigate on the left flank of Doreth's formation fired. A single beam weapon, directed at the outer hull of a pale remnant scout vessel that had drifted slightly ahead of the main Allied line. The scout vessel took the hit on its forward armor, lost power to 2 minor systems, and immediately began emergency broadcast on distress frequencies. Doreth's comms officer said, "Sir, that was Captain Ferris on the Ardent Cross. He is citing standing embargo enforcement protocol." Doreth said, "I did not order that shot." His comms officer said, "No, sir." The battle was already starting. The Velthari ships on the Allied right moved to cover the damaged scout vessel, and 2 Draani carriers repositioned to fill the gap, and the 1,200 ships that had been sitting still for 2 days began to move with the kind of coordinated efficiency that Doreth had told himself they were not capable of. Not the coordinated efficiency of a trained fleet following a command structure. The coordinated efficiency of 1,200 individual captains who had all made the same decision at the same moment, because someone had just fired at one of their own. The engagement lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Dorath fought it the way he had been trained to fight, with discipline, with tactical rotation, with the correct application of force at the correct points. His 400 ships performed well. 3 Allied vessels were destroyed. 11 Council ships were destroyed. 42 were disabled. The Allied fleet absorbed the damage the way a large body of water absorbs a thrown stone. The ripple spread, the surface broke for a moment, and then the weight of the whole thing continued to move forward undisturbed. At hour 3, Dorath ordered a tactical withdrawal to a holding position 12,000 kilometers behind his original advance line. His second-in-command, Breck, filed no objection. Half the command staff looked relieved. In the silence after the withdrawal, Dorath sat down at the small desk in his command quarters and began writing. Not the official after-action report. That would require authorization from Council Command before he could file it. He wrote the real one, the one with the actual numbers in it. The one that described what those Draani carriers had done when the Pale Remnant scout vessel took the hit. The way they had moved without being asked, without a signal, without coordination that any intelligence system could have predicted. He wrote about the 11 minutes of names and dates and council reference numbers that had played on every open frequency in the sector while his fleet was advancing. He wrote about Captain Ferris and the single shot he had not ordered. He did not know yet what he would do with what he had written. He knew he would not destroy it. The council did not fall. That was the part nobody in the galactic press seemed to know how to write about. They had covered the vote, the embargo, the gathering fleet, the 4-hour engagement at the edge of human space. They expected a conclusion that matched the scale of what had come before: a siege, a surrender, a formal ending with signatures and ceremonies. What they got instead was something slower and harder to photograph. 3 species withdrew from council membership within 30 days of the engagement. The Velthari were first. Their government filed the withdrawal without public statement, without ceremony, just a single formal document submitted to council records at 600 on a Wednesday. The Draani followed 6 days later. The third withdrawal came from a species called the Sarathi, who had not been directly involved in the engagement at all, but who cited Dorath's engagement record as evidence that council enforcement had become indistinguishable from aggression. Dorath's after-action report, the real one, the one with the actual numbers, was submitted against Council Command's explicit instruction to hold it pending review. He filed it anyway, under his personal authorization, addressed to the Public Council Records Archive rather than to his commanding officers. By the time council administrators moved to suppress it, the document had already been copied and distributed by 43 independent relay nodes. It became the most read document in council history within a month. Yevra was not removed from her position. The council had no legal mechanism for removing a councillor based on a failed policy recommendation. She had followed procedure, the vote had been legitimate, and Dorath's insubordination was technically the point of failure in the enforcement chain, not her strategic assessment. She remained in her seat, attended sessions, cast votes, but the chamber was different now. 3 species empty at their assigned positions. Other delegates who had voted for the outlawing doing the arithmetic of what it had cost and what it might cost next. She cast her votes alone in a way she had not before. Ron heard about Dorath's report from a junior council aide who had accessed the public archive in the early hours of the morning and come to find him with the look of someone who had just read something that rearranged their understanding of the last several months. The aide asked him if he had known. Ron said he had not known about the report. He had known about the man. The aide asked him what would happen next. What would the humans do, now that the engagement was over and the Armada had pulled back and nobody had formally declared anything that could be formally ended? Ron thought about Nadia. He had spoken to her twice since the engagement. The first call had been brief. She had been in the middle of coordinating damage assessments across the Allied fleet, matching human repair crews with Velthari technical teams and Draani logistics officers in a process that apparently required arguing loudly about hull plating tolerances, welding standards, and which species measurement system to use as the baseline. She had sounded more energized than he had heard her in years. The second call had been longer. Sura's team had completed shield array modifications on 14 additional stations. The Pale Remnant scout crews were teaching human navigators their charting system, 6 positional variables instead of 3, significantly more accurate in dense transit corridors. A Draani medical officer had identified a respiratory condition, misdiagnosed in 17 human crew members for years, because no human doctor had ever cross-referenced Draani atmospheric data for comparison. None of this was part of a plan. No treaty, no formal alliance, no joint command structure. Things were just happening because people with shared problems had found each other and discovered they each had pieces of what the other needed. Ron told the aide, "I genuinely do not know what they will do. That is the most accurate answer I can give you." The aide looked disappointed by this, which Ron understood. People who worked in council politics were accustomed to situations that had a shape, a position, a counterposition, a negotiated middle. What was happening in human space did not have that shape. It had the shape of something that was still forming. He did not tell the aide that this was what made it so difficult to stop. On Earth's outer defense flagship, a navigation officer named Fenn sat at his station 3 days after the engagement and processed a routine course request. He had been on duty during the 4-hour battle and had spent most of it managing real-time course corrections as the Allied fleet repositioned around the Council Armada. He was 22 years old and had been a navigation officer for 14 months. Before the embargo, he had expected his career to involve survey runs and commercial escort routes in well-mapped space. The course request he was processing now was for a region that had not appeared on any official council chart. It had appeared on Pale Remnant smuggler maps, then on a hybrid chart that one of the Remnant navigators had shared with the human station 3 weeks ago, and then on an updated survey run that a mixed crew of human and Velthari operators had completed using the Remnant's 6-variable positioning system. The sector had no official name. Someone on the survey team had penciled in a designation on the working chart and it had stuck: New Reach. Fenn filed the course, marked the destination in the navigation system under the new designation, and returned to his other work. The name held. Nobody voted on it. Nobody authorized it. It was simply what the place was called now, in the charts of a fleet that had not existed 2 months ago, moving through space that the Council had not thought to claim.